The Bethany organization fits here to provide service, and that's what it's always tried to do.
Our faith-based origins help with those values. We want every individual to feel like we are doing the best we can for them individually, caring about the people and showing that they are the most important thing. If we can continue to demonstrate that in all we do, then that's always going to be, I think, the biggest accomplishment for the organization. Despite all the changes over the years, despite sometimes rapid growth, sometimes then changes where we had to go in a different direction, I do think that we have been able to stick to our roots and stick to our values, and that's also a huge accomplishment over 100 years.
At the dawn of the 20th century, settlers had begun to pour into Alberta, toting big dreams and can-do spirits in search of new opportunity. Pioneers faced the difficult task of building communities from the ground up, and quickly worked to adapt familiar institutions like churches, schools, and hospitals to the new conditions and surroundings they found themselves in. These organizations became integral to the fabric of the community, often serving as a sole source of support and care for community members. In 1922, the Balf Lutheran Church saw the need for a facility to help care for elderly homesteaders, and answered the call by creating the Bethany Old People's Home.
Early 1900s, it was really starting to get active. The homesteaders were arriving, putting stakes in the ground. There was a real need for community, and the Balf Lutheran Church was kind of the center of that at that time. In 1906, we needed a hospital in Balf, of all things. That was the only hospital between Wetaskiwin and Saskatoon on the CPR line at that time. So it was busy. They had one doctor and these 4 nurses. They had between 5 and 9 patients coming per day. So it was pretty hectic. As all these newcomers, everything gets settled, and then there's more hospitals. Then this building is starting maybe to be older, so then it wasn't needed as a hospital. In 1918, there were so many homesteaders who came. They were single young men. They're by themselves. They were aging and they needed help. They didn't have family here. The church identified that need and said, hey, why don't we buy the hospital and start a facility to take care of these elderly homesteaders?
The Norwegian Lutherans had some history of providing old people's homes in the U.S., but there was nothing like that in Canada.
The church worked with their parent organization. Right away, they had 10 or 12 residents.
In the beginning, it was entirely the church for decades. That was the sole source of support for whatever was operated. And why was it? Because they cared about the neighbors.
The pastor of the church was the manager of the old folks' home. The relationship between the church and Bethany was amazing. They did things like had the residents over for Sunday dinner. The Balf Lutheran congregation, they would have a schedule and have them out to their farm for a little day trip. The church women would serve lunch, go over and have some kind of, Bible studies and that type of thing. And the church was like a block away from the Bethany building. They had their own milk cows. They had their own garden, chickens. So it was a community-supported facility. It's a great story because it shows how a small number of concerned people can do anything they want. At that time, life wasn't easy. We're talking before the Depression. Yet people were willing to do that work to take care of their community and the people who needed help. That's really something to be proud of. So the board of directors also came from the church, and then the pastor was the manager, so he hired the staff. They had a sister, Sister Marie. She was more of the spiritual needs, but she also worked with everybody. My aunt, Helga Jacobs, she was 17 years old, and she was raised on the farm. It's a small community. They need help. at Bethany, in the kitchen. So she got a job there. She had big responsibilities. She learned, how to cook for a large group and, prepare the meals, prepare the room. She was there 24/7. She lived in the building. She would have to go 7 miles on a horse to get to work every day, so she just lived right in the building with the seniors. And some of them needed care at night, so she would be there. What an opportunity for a young lady off the farm to get a job at that time, right? And to be with other people and new experiences, new responsibilities. It was a great time of her life, for sure. Behind the building, they had kind of a lean-to for the cows. And they also had a small building that they brought in, they called it a men's residence. They didn't have quite enough room, so then they had another little house where some of the men would live there, and a big garden, right? It was all right there. Well, the big thing on the main floor, of course, was the kitchen and the dining room. The dining room was amazing. It was very well kept, very well decorated. The bedrooms and so on would be upstairs. Yeah, I think it was just more run like a household. It sounds like it was such a nice atmosphere. Like my aunt, she just loved working there. So Bethany continued, but then as other areas developed and Camrose became bigger and more services, by 1949, the move was made to the first home in Camrose.
There was always the dream of what might be the next step. And so the church pulled together and raised the money and built the new Sunset home in Camrose in 1949.
As surrounding communities continued to grow, the church congregation set their sights on the expansion of their services, and in late summer of 1949, the Sunset home was relocated to a new building in Camrose to accommodate more residents.
First, they built on an auxiliary hospital to the Sunset home, and so that was higher care residents than the Sunset home would have seen. And then eventually they built on a nursing home to that as well. That whole location had this kind of sprawling, beautiful banks going down to the creek. So a really lovely setting, and for many years took care of people of various needs in those facilities.
When Bethany grew and came to Camrose, there were still the pastors who were the ones who were called to be the administrators for quite a number of years. Basically, the annual meeting for the Bethany group would happen during synod conventions, our church conventions. There's a lot about Bethany that's so wonderful and good. There's something about God who comes to be one of us, right? That just motivates us to care for somebody else. That's what we're about at Bethany Group. That's what we're to be about, care for people. There's many, many older people who, for various kinds of reasons, found themselves outside of church pieces. But when you get into a facility where you need to be cared for, where you're not able to care for yourself as much, then it's such an important piece to have somebody that has a listening ear. And I think that's a lot of what pastors do, is they come in and hear where people are at, and then try to provide a word of hope. Pastors would also, of course, provide worship services, and so the songs that people remembered and the words that they remembered, reading scriptures, which was so helpful for many, many. It was, like, not everybody, but many of those people had a deep and long-lasting faith. In those early days, the people who were being served also were people serving. Many of those people couldn't get out of bed, but they could fold linens. They could fold the washcloths. And so the people who are living here in this place have this wealth of value that sometimes we miss. And that's one of the opportunities I get as a pastor, is just to hear some of the value pieces that people have, and some of the experiences that they've had that just bring joy to my life. Yeah.
Part of our values is not forgetting our faith-based roots. We don't have that formal relationship with the Lutheran Church any longer, but even before we had ended that formal relationship, it was about any kind of faith. We've heard our chaplaincy coordinator talk about thinking about the future and having faith origins that are not Christian as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. We don't have that much in our population yet, but that will be changing as time goes on. And we need to be open to that and learning about those things. And so he's really got his eye on that and looking to see what we can do to continue to meet people's faith needs.
He makes me down to
In 1966, Bethany developed its own act of legislation.
It has 3 acts, actually. One formed the Bethany Nursing Home of Camrose, Alberta. One formed the Bethany Long-Term Care of Alberta. And the one was the Bethany Sunset Home of Camrose, Alberta Act. So the acts of the legislature passed in 1966, which formed the organization. So I'm not even quite sure how that even came into being, So I used to have great relish when people would say to me, well, we can't find you in the Corporations Act. I said, no, because we have our own act of the legislature. Who actually came up with this grand idea of getting your own act of the legislature? I don't know, but it was always intrigued me. When you think about some forward thinking, because it gave us great flexibility sometimes, being able to operate in your own world.
A constant inclination to serve the needs of the community continued to drive Bethany's work. The commitment to strong communication, combined with a penchant for listening and understanding, allowed the organization to effectively create the services most desired by the community. The late 70s saw the creation of the Seniors Self-Contained Housing Program, offering low to moderate income seniors access to housing for independent living. Bethany continued to build upon these services through the 1980s and finished the decade with the opening of the first life lease building in Alberta and possibly in all of Canada.
You have to retain the respect of the community. We tried to continue to communicate with the community in every which way we could figure out to do, to help them understand what we were doing, what our needs were, and to understand also by listening what their needs were. One of the needs that surfaced before very long in the 80s was from a group of people you wouldn't necessarily think of as being needy, but they were people who didn't need any subsidy for anything, but they didn't want to live in their big house anymore. They wanted to live in a condo or something like that, but there were no condos. And that led us to a fairly extensive survey. And what they told us was we're looking for comfort, security, freedom, and friends.
We were a bit of a hub for an East Central Alberta area, and there were a lot of people who were considering Camrose as retiring to the city. You know, because they were coming from those surrounding communities and coming here for the services. And Lakeside was a really big step because it was different than anything we'd ever heard of. The whole concept of life lease, like what's that?
Through the benefit of some conferences that I was allowed to attend, we picked up the concept of life lease, which is how Lakeside was funded through essentially loans from the people who live there for the value of the building. And they get their money back when they move out. That was a totally new concept in Alberta, and I think it may have been even in Canada. By working with the community and finding out what they were able and willing to do, we made it happen. Communications was a big thing, and we were really happy to have Diane Hutchinson working with us. She began as a volunteer, part-time, a little bit, doing our first newsletter.
Dave Stoley introduced me to the concept of servant leadership, which is a concept that is still very meaningful to me, that I practice regularly. He was among the most compassionate human beings I've ever met. He was always very centered on how people are, and the person part always came first. That was true for him, but that was true for the organization as well.
In 1992, Bethany took over management of the Rosehaven Provincial Program, providing specialized outreach and inpatient services to support people with behaviors that were difficult to manage in their current setting. Soon after, the organization began to operate as the Bethany Group, a name that more accurately reflected the breadth of its work.
Rosehaven at that point in time had been a government mental health facility. Late in the 80s, they approached Bethany to see if they would consider taking on the management of that program. And at that time, they were building this new building here with this atrium attached to the heritage building. It would have been, I believe, 92 when they signed those agreements and took on the management then of Rosehaven. And that's when the Bethany Group name really kind of came into being, because they weren't just Bethany Nursing Home and Auxiliary Hospital anymore, and to reflect that larger part of the organization. So picking up these different pieces and, accepting the different cultures that seem to happen, mini cultures in different sites, but yet they all seem to fit with the overall mission and values of the organization.
Wonderful, competent staff at Rosehaven, but they came from a totally different background. It was a significant shock, I think, for some of them to get joined on to an organization whose roots were all in the church. The people I worked with when I first came were just marvelous folks who cared deeply about what they did. Burnell was a part of a very strong and wonderful group of recreation staff in the 80s. They were very creative and totally engaging.
My father was the baker here at Rosehaven, and at the time he was baking 500 loaves of bread a day. Recreation therapy was quite new, programs that would try to build their self-esteem. I enjoyed the music part of it. I did a baking program. There were people that really wanted to dance, and so then I had to dance, and so then all these little ladies, their shoulders would be going up like this, and just anxious to be dancing again. We would do an adapted dance program with them to be able to have them experience that one more time.
While the Bethany Group has continued to evolve throughout the years, one constant remains: a commitment to providing high-quality care with the same compassion and love of a family.
I always try to make it a safe environment and a home-like environment for Grandma and Grandpa, right? Because it's their home.
You get a lot of self-satisfaction and stuff. And my coworkers, they are like my family.
You're a family there. I always felt this way. I never wanted anyone to die alone. If they didn't have family, that was difficult, I think. And I think that you get attached to your people. It's hard on us when someone passes away because you miss them. Nursing care is number one. I mean, they come there because they're not able to live alone and care for themselves. So that's vital, but you want them to enjoy themselves. We had wonderful community groups that came in every once in a while, and church groups that gave us gifts for our residents. So what we did, Christmas Eve, we had the residents leave a sock out. And the evening staff would have fun putting these gifts in, I wouldn't have been anyplace else. I enjoyed my time. I really did.
It is the care, it is the people that are around them, and the involvement that they could have. I think it's a very rich experience for the families and the people that are there. They may not realize it at the time, but later on when they look back and realize it was a good place for their loved one to be.
The mid-90s saw the regionalization of all health services in Alberta, and with it, a change in the way government funded housing and management work. The government's classification of the Bethany Group as a management body brought new opportunities for expansion and a new direction with the development of a residential living program.
It was just before I left that they were regionalizing all health services, and there was a strong suggestion that the new regional health authority was just going to take us over and wipe us out on the grounds that they were going to organize, operate all the health facilities in the region.
I suppose if you look at the larger framework, what was happening in Alberta at the time, I think 1995 was a huge change in health authorities coming in, the way government funded housing and management bodies. So I think the Bethany was still digesting that when I started in 98. We were classified as a management body from government's perspective, and that allowed some expansion in terms of looking at different options. So housing started to increase over the years. We presented to the board in about October this possibility of building this new building, Deer Meadows, which wasn't government subsidized. It would be totally private from Bethany's behalf, and the sort of role it would fulfill in the community and the needs it would fulfill. So we went ahead, and that was probably one of the starts of moving into that new direction, as opposed to the health side. Later on in the 2000s was where we started to work with other organizations.
The early 2000s brought a decade of rapid growth to the organization, and the amalgamation of services and staff into new rural facilities presented its own challenges. Strong leadership, dedicated staff, and generous volunteers have allowed the Bethany Group to expand and grow without sacrificing resident care.
The relationship we started to have with some of these other organizations who all had boards. So they were housing boards mostly, and made up of local representatives from each community, mostly elected officials. By coming together, we started pooling our resources, and collectively we became very strong in terms of being able to provide the IT resources, which just expanded huge, in terms of trying to keep up, as well as legislation and standards and policies. And instead of 6 or 7 different organizations all struggling to try and do this individually, we said by coming together, we can actually free up resources by having a combined policies, procedures, and those type of things. The difficulties we had were what was the relationship between those boards and the Bethany board? We actually treated every organization as equals. Nobody was more than, just because of money or resources, we're bigger than you, doesn't mean to say we actually have a bigger seat at the table. So I don't think that we were really that far apart, because we were all in the same game, had been for a long time. Some of these organizations had been around for a long time, serving the local community for seniors.
Prior to the opening of Basha Meadows, there was Basha Valley Lodge, and there was also Basha Care Center. The people that were coming together were staff from the Basha Care Center. They were the staff from Basha Valley Lodge, and then there was also external staff, some of them that had never worked for Bethany before, and others that may have worked from other Bethany sites. So that first time was, first of the opening was very, very challenging. And it helped because there was leadership that came right on site. But the gem of it is our volunteers and how they come into Basha Meadows and they extend their time and themselves and impact the lives of our residents. And also our staff, for the majority, is rural. And we're really lucky we're able to retain that staffing. They're hardworking people who are making a difference in the lives of our seniors.
Hopefully the Bethany Group was be an example of the good things you can do. And it's not about profit. I remember when we separated more formally from the church, we didn't sacrifice things for the sake of profit. What we would hopefully be able to say is that any surpluses we made would be able to be put back into the organization for the benefit of our residents.
Some of those expansion days in the early 2000s, it was going so fast. I think that was a real challenge for the leadership team at the time. And it was hard to keep up with things. I think we've had a chance now, things have stayed somewhat stable in terms of growth anyway, so that we could take a step back and say, okay, are we okay? Are we doing things the way that we should be doing them? And in some cases decided no, we weren't, and have gone back into those processes and said, let's fix this and let's make sure that we're doing things the way we should be. We've made a real effort on improving our communication in the last, well, I would say especially through the pandemic, but that's a real focus moving forward too. There's certainly lots of challenges, and I think I've always learned something new in whatever capacity I've worked at, and I continue to learn things new, but people are what makes the difference, and we're here to serve people. It's hard to envision as much changes as we've seen over 100 years. One of our centenarians, his words that really stuck with me were, don't be afraid of change. We have certainly gone with change, and I think, you know, somebody asked me once why I stayed here, and I said, well, it was never boring. We were always changing. There were always new things to learn and new things to do, and that's going to continue to be probably all of our futures, right? We have to change. We have to move along with the things that happen, and we just want to guide the change in a good direction.
With a century of history and growth behind it, the Bethany Group has seen massive change. But it's the ability to embrace change and assess needs, combined with an unwavering desire to be of service, that will ensure another 100 years of success.